I'm really delighted to welcome our speaker today, Sue Brown. So Sue studied history originally at Oxford and Toronto, and then became a civil servant. And she had a very varied career and became head of arts in the Department of Culture, Media and Sport. So, she was a senior civil servant. And then after taking early retirement, she's written several biographies and a number of articles about significant figures in 19th century culture, some of them better known, some of them less well known. And her most recent one is a wonderful biography of Julia Wedgwood, about whom she's speaking to us today. So over to you, Sue.
Thanks very much, Alison. It's very nice to be with you all. I have to say, as Alison has said, I'm trained as a historian and I've done some work on 19th century literature, so I'm not really a philosopher. So if I get my language wrong and my concepts aren't what they should be, please forgive me, and I'm sure you're very welcome to straighten me out. Julia Wedgwood, a lady who's beginning to be rather better known now than she was. For a long time, she was known only as the niece of Charles Darwin and a lady who had this rather enigmatic, short but very intense relationship with Robert Browning. Now, I think there's a growing interest in her writings, which they cover a phenomenal range. And as Josie Harris says in the New Oxford DMB, she was second only to George Eliot in her ability to cover what were termed masculine topics. So let's say a little bit about her family background. She was the eldest child of 6 of Fanny and Hensley Wedgwood, the only one of the children who didn't marry. She was the great-granddaughter of the famous potter, Josiah Wedgwood, but she was just as proud of the fact that her mother was the daughter of Sir James Mackintosh, the Scottish, well, he was a great mix of things. I mean, everybody said he was a genius, but he never quite lived up to that. But he was a historian, a politician, a lawyer, a philosopher, you name it, he did it. And Fanny Mackintosh was very proud of her father, and Julia of being Sir James's granddaughter. Julia's favourite aunt was Emma Wedgwood. She married her cousin, Charles Darwin. So Charles Darwin was in effect Julia's uncle. Her education was just about the best that a girl in those days could get. And I think that reflects the fact that she came from a Unitarian background, and others of the women that we've talked about in this series also have strong Unitarian connections. Wedgwoods tended to move up and join the Church of England as they got more prosperous. Hensley Wedgwood, Julia's father, stayed fairly close to his Unitarian independent roots. He was educated at Rugby. He did go to Cambridge, where he had signed the 39 Articles, something he later came to regret because he was a man of principle. Back in London, he tended to stay with the more independent preachers, the great Unitarian James Martineau, also Alexander Scott. Julia's mother liked a good preacher. She was fond of James Martineau, but also Frederick Dennis Morris, who's a man whose influence in his day was enormous. I mean, his funeral was supposed to be followed by more people than anyone since the Duke of Wellington. And that was possibly his reputation as the founder of Christian socialism and the London Working Men's College, He was also a fine theologian, professor of theology at Cambridge, and he founded the first Institute for Higher Education for Women, Queen's College in London. Julia's parents took the education of girls seriously, and they sent her for 1 year to Rachel Martineau's school in Liverpool, where her brother James taught the big subjects: Latin, German, history, natural history, New Testament studies. And then back in London, she was in the first intake at Queen's College, set up in 1848, and then the following year moved to the first intake at Bedford College, founded by Mrs. Jesser Reed, a rich Unitarian widow. Darwin, Charles Darwin's older brother, was very active and in that college, as were Julia's parents. And the leading but most controversial teacher there was Frank Newman, the brother of the man we know as Cardinal Newman, and an outstanding intellect. Julia dropped out of Bedford College in 1852 after a serious health attack, which I think was probably viral meningitis. That increased her tendency to deafness, which was something women in the Wedgwood family particularly suffered from, but also to really terrible headaches, migraines, depressions, which she suffered, you know, and at one stage was galvanized for it. Having left college, she kept on studying by herself. She taught herself Greek. She worked on her Latin, German, French, Italian. She read widely. What did she learn from her three teachers? I think James Martineau, she said, opened the doors of knowledge to me. He gave her a facility for asking questions, and also a sense, Martineau was very much influenced by German Romantic philosophy, despite his Unitarianism. And she got from him that sense that empirical observation was never going to offer a complete explanation of the natural world. He also, in a sense, Martineau warmed up Unitarianism. He made spiritual emotion respectable within Unitarianism. I think the influence of F.D. Maurice on her was probably even greater, though she only really realized it in her later years. Maurice's fundamental belief was a belief in the unity of all creation, also a sense which he shared with a Scottish mystic, Thomas Erskine, that we'll come to, a sense that eternal life was not something that you got in the next life, but a quality of life which was available in this world. That sort of thinking made him very suspect. He was sacked from his job as Professor of Theology at King's College London, and his social activism, his interest in improving the condition of working men, also made him suspect in some quarters. He founded the London Working Men's College, and out of that grew the London Working Women's College, where Julia would later teach. Now, the most brilliant of all her teachers was Frank Newman. He got a double first at Oxford when I think he was only 20, but he's never sort of settled in his views. He was constantly inquiring, and as a result, his academic life all took place on the fringes. He ended up as a Unitarian. I think there probably weren't three men better and more influential as teachers of women in the 19th century than those three teachers Julia enjoyed. Another very important influence was, as I've already mentioned, the Scottish mystic Thomas Erskine of Linlatham. He was expelled from the Church of Scotland because he roundly rejected Calvinism. He couldn't abide the idea of God being a judge who held mankind on probation. He thought of him as a father, and a father who was constantly educating his people, his children, however resistant they were, to a greater knowledge of himself. He held house parties up in Scotland, which attracted some quite impressive people: Thomas and Jane Carlyle, Charles Kingsley, Jowett, the great classical scholar, Dean Stanley, whose wife was a lady in waiting to Queen Victoria, F.D. Morris, and Julia. For him, an inner consciousness was as important as any external sense. Beauty and order in the natural world mirrored those same qualities in the moral world. Suffering was something we had to put up with as an integral part of the world. He was, in a way, a surrogate father to Julia Wedgwood. So, shall we move on? What about Julia's publications? She was very friendly as a girl and young woman with Mrs. Gaskell. She stayed with Mrs. Gaskell, copying out some of the letters from Charlotte Bronte that went into the life of Charlotte Bronte. I think that inspired her to begin as a novelist, and she published 2 novels which were very well reviewed, but her father disapproved, particularly not of all women writing novels, but his daughter writing novels, because he felt that they disclosed too much emotion. So she turned to non-fiction and later recognized that she was much more comfortable with non-fiction than fiction. She started contributing to periodicals like The Leader. Her first important article was a 2-part review of On the Origin of Species that was published in Macmillan's magazine under the title The Boundaries of Science, a Dialogue. I think, well, we'll come to it. I think the title of her article was in part a riposte to Thomas Henry Huxley, who was one of her bugbears. The success of that article led Macmillan's to ask her to write more articles on religion and science. And she also wrote about the origin of human speech. 2 articles, one in Macmillan's and one in Westminster. And she did that basically to explain her father's views. There was a very lively public debate going on at the time about why it was that only humans spoke and how was it that they did. Her father was absolutely convinced. He took a naturalistic view. This was the mimetic school, the onomatopoeic school, animals hearing other animals exclaiming, taking those sounds, using them to identify themselves, to warn about things, whatever. And that was thumbnailed the poo-poo or bow-wow school of thought, and set up against Max Muller's idealistic view that the point about language was that language and thought were inseparable in human beings. The thought came to man and immediately he expressed it in language. That was called the Ding Dong School. And there were public debates on this. Queen Victoria even turned up for one of them, and lots of attention in the Illustrated London News. She went on to write a biography of John Wesley in 1870, again very well reviewed, but not a man she much took to. And then from 1870 to almost 1900, she was a regular contributor to The Spectator, though of course those articles weren't signed, and to the Contemporary Review, where her articles were signed, about literature, history, classics, science and religion, mysticism, Darwinism, feminism, a whole range of subjects generally thought of as beyond the capability of women. Her big book was The Moral Ideal in 1888, which was reissued in 1907, substantially revised. It was a history of human aspiration, as she described it, from early India to her own times, focusing on the human search for a divine element in life. Next book, Message of Israel in the Light of Modern Criticism, that was an attempt to bring German German biblical criticism to a wider audience, the thoughtful churchgoer who had doubts about whether the version of the creation of the world in Genesis was quite what you might take without question. Her last book, published 2 years after she died, was a biography of her great-grandfather that her family persuaded her to write. And she also published a collection of her essays, most of them profiles of some of the famous Victorians she'd known. So who were these famous Victorians? Well, she was very close from being a babe in arms to Harriet Martineau, who was a great friend of her mother. Harriet Martineau encouraged her as a writer. She was, in a way, a role model. But Julia rebelled quietly but very firmly against her when Martineau adopted Comtism. What upset Julia was the pleasure she took, or as Julia saw it, in denying that there was an afterlife. That Julia could not accept. She was also, as I said, close to Mrs. Gaskell, but the biggest friendship of her life was with Robert Browning when he was first back in London after the death of Elizabeth. He called on her regularly, they wrote to each other, the family were expecting marriage. She suddenly broke it off. She just couldn't handle the relationship, I think. But their correspondence shows just what a lively mind she had. I mean, Robert Browning was certainly the cleverest of all the Victorian poets, and she could keep up with him, which was very rare in women, apart, of course, from his wife Elizabeth. After the friendship with Browning broke up, she started calling regularly on George Eliot at the time when George Eliot was working on Middlemarch. Julia was very personally impressed by George Eliot, the greatest woman I ever knew. She also thought of her as a great moral teacher, and that was despite the fact that George Eliot was living openly with a married man and very firmly rejected Christianity in favour of Comtism. Someone else who was very important to Julia was her editor at The Spectator, Richard Hutton, who was the most influential of all the Victorian editors. Their admiration was mutual. They were constantly in touch about each other's work. They had many similarities in their points of view. Both had started from Unitarian backgrounds, but moved to the High Church. They were strongly anti-vivisection, strongly anti-Irish Home Rule, but Hutton, they were also admirers of Cardinal Newman, but Hutton was against giving votes to women, something Julia forgave him for. And then in her later years, she worked closely with the young E.M. Forster, who greatly admired her. She'd known him from being a baby. Others she knew, I mean, prominent Victorian cultural figures like the Carlyles, John Ruskin, Florence Nightingale, who she didn't have a lot of time for, and feminists like Barbara Bodichon, Emily Davis, and Josephine Butler. She did some unconventional things in her life. When she was almost 50 and her parents were ill, and she was the only child left at home, she left their nice house on Queen Anne Street. She took with her an uneducated Welsh chambermaid, Marion Hughes, and turned her into her companion. And that was a relationship which lasted until Julia's death in 1913, when Julia set her up in her will with an annuity which would have enabled her to lead a very comfortable middle class existence. But Marion Hughes couldn't get by in London without Julia and moved to Texas and died shortly after Julia. And she was very good friends with Frances Power Cobbe, who I think is, of all the Victorian female writers, the one that she is most like to, and also Victoria Welby. Both she and Cobbe were feminists. They were advocates of active advocates of female suffrage up until the cause was rejected in the Third Reform Act in 1884. Both passionate anti-vivisectionists, both very interested in religion, and both continued to move Cobbe perhaps more than Wedgwood in James Martineau's ambit. I also think Cobbe's theology was a little more venturesome than Julia Wedgwood's. Welby, Julia, she was getting older. She was a little careful about some of Welby's more speculative ideas, such as the spiral that we talked about at our last session. So let's talk briefly about Julia as a feminist. I think some of the evidence of it is the way she presented herself without any apology as a female intellectual who could write about whatever she chose. She didn't accept that there were boundaries on what women could write about. She was invited to write the key article in what was a seminal collection published in 1869, edited by Josephine Butler, A Woman's Work and a Woman's Culture, and she was asked to make the case for female suffrage. She served as the unofficial tutor in classics for the first intake of young women at what became Girton College at Cambridge in 1869. She went knocking on doors and putting leaflets through letterboxes as part of Elizabeth Garrett Anderson's very successful campaign for election to the London School Board in 1871. She wrote articles, she wrote an outspoken pamphlet on female suffrage for the London National Society for Women's Suffrage. She signed all the petitions when the Third Reform Act was going through Parliament. The defeat there turned her and Cobbe away from the argument over female suffrage. They accepted that if Gladstone was willing to give the vote to what he himself called the peasants, but not to female farm managers or business women, that their case was lost and they should put their energies into other causes, notably anti-vivisection. I think Julia Wedgwood's feminism was quite distinctive. She didn't argue for the vote on the grounds of equality of men and women. She argued for it on the grounds of fairness. And she wanted the vote not as a symbol, not for what it is, but what it would imply about the standing of women. And above all, she thought it would normalize relations between men and women. It would get them away from that exclusive focus on will he, won't he ask me to marry him, and should I say yes or no, and make proper friendships between men and women possible. She also thought it would strengthen marriage, which for Julia was a very important objective, by putting both parties on the same terms. It would lead to a wide, enduring common life. And in her pamphlet, she spoke up for single women who had to make their own living and get by, but had no part in the polity. So if we look overall at Julia Wedgwood's thinking, what are some of the key elements? I think the most important is one that she probably got from F.D. Maurice, and that was a belief in unity. It was expressed in many ways, the unity of man with God and with nature, unity within the family, unity within the nation, which became more important to Julia after the Boer War. The desire for unity and the need of finding our place as parts of an orderly whole belongs to the deepest part of our nature, she wrote. Something else that was absolutely fundamental to her was her concern with religion and this belief in this confidence that there would be an afterlife. And the afterlife was going to be the place where you were reunited with all those you had loved and lost, where it would be a place of easy, instant communication, which I think is rather poignant for someone who by the end of her life was pretty well stone deaf and relied for most of her mature years on an ear trumpet. The idea that there would be easy communication in the afterlife and that you would continue that process of being perfected, which is an important element in her thinking. Her confidence in the afterlife was disturbed when her eldest brother died prematurely. He was just 30 in 1864. Maurice's reassurances were far too confident for her at that time. So she turned away from Maurice and towards Browning, who was much more sympathetic to religious doubt and proved a very good friend to her at that time. She did go through periods of religious doubt. That wasn't so much the impact of Darwinism or materialism or doubts about Christian dogma. It was just a sense that evil was everywhere and omnipotent and that God was absent. And this often coincided with periods of ill health and depression. But it gave her a sympathy for other people with religious doubts, which she found far more sympathetic than those making facile, fundamental assertions about religion. As she wrote, belief is arduous, distracting, incomplete. Belief is personal. Science is one of those things of which we must say they are certain. Faith is one of those things of which we must say I am certain. So that will give you some sense as we move along, Clotilde, of how she approached Darwin's work. I think there were four main, what have we got there? Well, I added one on a different draft. Well, 3 or 4 main points of view. Obviously, she was proud of his work as a member of the family in this great scientific discovery. Science was something Julia was brought up and continued to think of very highly. She recognized that Darwin's work, however uncomfortable, was groundbreaking. I think the fact that she'd grown up in a Unitarian environment was also important. Unitarian belief that science was the way of discovering God's purposes for mankind, as well as a Unitarian belief in man's perfectibility and in the importance of the environment. She was also brought up on natural theology, old-fashioned though she tended to think of it later in her life. And she saw science as progressive, and that fit with her belief in a world which was also progressing however long it took towards the perfection of the afterlife. And beyond that, as we've already mentioned, she was a believer in the unity of God's creation. So it was easier for her to accept origin than it was for many others who thought they shared her Christian beliefs, but saw this unbridgeable gap between humans, articulate beings who possessed souls and could be saved, and brute creation. But there was a fundamental disagreement between Julia and Darwin, which Darwin highlighted, which was about whether natural selection was an accidental progress or the result of continuing divine intervention. As I've already said, I think her dialogue, The Boundaries of Science, was also a riposte to Huxley, because in a previous edition of Macmillan's, Huxley had said, this is all too difficult and technical, and the public, with all their suspicions and so on, they'd better just keep out of the debate over natural selection. We scientists will sit down and examine it and work out together whether it's a valid new discovery. I think Darwin was a very good publicizer of his work. He deliberately presented his argument in Origin in optimistic form, and he referred in the second edition of Origin, in his final paragraph, to the creator who had instigated all these forms of great beauty to which he refers. Julia took that up and argued in her article that the scientists had a right to unfettered investigation. But at the same time, she didn't accept that non-scientists had to stand back and keep out. She saw science and religion as on parallel courses, which eventually, very long way in the future, would come together. But she wasn't troubled, as most people were, by the links Darwin saw with the animal world. And she said, though I'm not sure I quite believe her, that she wasn't troubled by something that troubled Darwin, which was the extent of the suffering and destruction involved in natural selection. She was, of course, impressed by his idea, which also comes out in Origin, of creation as progressive and leading ultimately to perfection. Darwin admired her review of Origin, though he pointed out that he thought of divine intervention as accidental rather than a continuing presence. He also admired a review that she wrote in The Spectator of his, well, not his next book, he's written several in between, but a book which took up some of the themes of Origin of Species by looking at the place of man within nature, something Darwin had largely avoided doing in his first book. But the title of the book is not just The Descent of Man, it's also And Selection in Relation to Sex. And that was something which most of the early reviewers didn't even notice, but it was the thing that Julia Wedgwood concentrated on in her review of Descent. I think partly she may already have seen Francis Power Cobbe's review, which had dealt with the most controversial aspect of Descent of Man, about the naturalism of the development of man's moral sense. That was not something that either Cobbe or Julia Wedgwood could go along with. And in a sense, what Darwin said about selection in relation to sex, when we read it now, is even more controversial, because he saw the distinction between men and women intensifying over the years, and women as very much the weaker sex, and their weakness would get greater as the development of the species continued. But Julia avoided these difficult issues. Instead, she attempted to portray Darwin as a theist. She said that Darwin, like St. Paul, portrayed men as beginning in weakness and overcoming that basic weakness through disinterested affection and the ability to mold their own instincts, giving them love, reason, freedom, conscience, the power to sin. And that's a very different conclusion from Darwin, who said that morality grew out of the exposition of self-regarding virtue, uh, men behaving well and getting social recognition from that and social cohesion following. There had been a debate about how morality developed between Darwin and Hensley Wedgwood. Julia and Darwin's daughter Etty were allowed to read the letters but not to take part in the debate, a debate which got absolutely nowhere because I mean, Hensley was a man of principle and he was never going to go for an entirely naturalistic explanation of the development of morality, even though he, of course, insisted on a naturalistic explanation of the origin of speech. So Julia and Etty conducted their own private correspondence in which Julia wrote about innate disposition rather than utility as the motive of right conduct. We radiate whatever we are, she wrote, not something Etty understood. But I wonder whether that doesn't reflect the influence of Sir James Mackintosh's thought. Nonetheless, Julia developed increasing reservations about Darwin's views, or at least about the aggression of the scientists in promoting them, Huxley in particular. And this came to a head after Darwin's death, when his son Frank was writing a biography of his father, and they did, of course, have to present Darwin's views on religion. Darwin had explained them himself. He'd written his own version of the development of his thought on this for family consumption. Julia thought that his own explanation ought to be published, as did Darwin's sons, but Etty thought that that would damage Darwin's reputation. So Julia wrote a sort of rather sanitized version of what Darwin had written that the family didn't accept. And perhaps because her attempt to show Darwin as much closer to Christianity than most people believed, perhaps because it had been rejected so readily. When the biography came out, Julia shocked the family by writing a very critical review of it, or rather of Darwin. I think by then he was well on the way to becoming Saint Charles Darwin, which to a degree he still is. And Julia felt that was dishonest. She described him as a destroyer of the religious certainties of many at that time, who had never really made the attempt to relate his scientific discoveries to religious ideas, something she felt that he as a scientist ought to have done. She saw him as a theist who refused to acknowledge that fact or to look beyond his observations of the natural world. She also believed that although he agreed himself, he'd lost his aesthetic sense for the beauty of the natural world and resisted the idea of personal religion, she still felt that if he'd made a bit more effort, he could have reconciled his science with what she saw as the essentials of Christian belief, shorn of all those things which she, Julia, didn't find so convincing: miracles, literal word of the Bible, and above all, the threat of hellfire. Now, we're getting short on time, and I think Julia's most important book is one that Alison has written about extremely well, and I think I recommend you all to read what Alison says in her book on 19th century women philosophers. But let me just say, The Moral Ideal, published in 1888, was an extraordinarily ambitious work for a woman to have published. As she described it herself, it traced the history of man's aspiration, starting with primitive Indian civilization and continuing up to her own time. She saw this very much in dialectic terms, not a Comtean dialectic, but her own adaptation of that sort of process, action, reaction, synthesis. But for her, this was a process taking place on an upwards path towards the ideal. So she saw civilizations as flourishing and then meeting their opposites, and then a synthesis of a civilization which pulls together what's forward-looking in the two initial civilizations, as for example with Greece, ancient Greece, which she saw as the key civilization in world history. But she was concerned with obstructions to unity, the caste system in India, slavery, exclusion of women in ancient Greece, the unnatural treatment of women in Augustinian theology, or in medieval times, monasticism and the cult of the Virgin Mary, which was getting away from the reality of women's participation. And I think she saw what she was writing very much as an alternative to Darwinian evolution. She was writing about not man's physical evolution, but man's moral evolution. If there's time, my watch isn't working. Is there time to read her final?
Yes, yes.
You quote it and I quote it. Let's see. They who feel that nature exhausts God, that the summits of human virtue are the summits of moral excellence, that reverence is the provision for inferiority and fades away before man reaches those heights towards which he is always striving, they can find in the moral thought of the past little but a collection of errors. Man, if we judge him by history, knows himself only so far as he turns towards the eternal other of the human spirit. He finds his true unity only as he finds a larger unity, which makes him one with himself and with his brother man. I think that's, you've got in there Goethe, you've got German Romanticism, you've got a rejection of Comteism, you've got an idealism which is central to her later thinking. This is the final section, Wilder Shores, and we won't go into any detail here. In the 1890s, you had much more diversity of thought and all sorts of extraordinary ideas going around. Julia's father was a convinced spiritualist. For years, the rest of the family saw it as a bit of a joke. But Hensley was converted at a séance where the attendance was quite extraordinary. It included George Eliot and George Henry Lewis, Charles Darwin and Emma Darwin. Charles Darwin got bored very early. Thomas Huxley, Hensley Wedgwood, Fanny Wedgwood, Julia Wedgwood, and others. That's quite an assembly of minds. Hensley Wedgwood was pretty immediately convinced by it all. Julia didn't become a spiritualist until after her mother's death, when Marion Hughes conveyed a message to her. I think she and a clairvoyant had sort of got together to try and give Julia some comfort after her mother's death. So they conveyed a so-called message from her mother to her, which she absolutely believed and defended against all the detailed examinations from Cambridge. She also became an advocate of what she called the correlation of force, which later became conservation of energy, which she thought of as possibly a greater scientific discovery than Darwin's evolutionary theory. What particularly appealed to her was the proof, as Tate Stewart's The Unseen Universe presented it, of a connection between the visible and the invisible, these threads of energy in the ether. For a time, she went in for Hintonism through her friend Mary Everest Boole, who was a brilliant but rather unreliable lady. She was on the fringes of theosophy. I think she began to think that the threat from Darwinism was receding. So in her revise of the moral ideal that E.M. Forster helped her do in 1907, there's less about Darwin and more about feminism. But the book came out, and by then the public wasn't really interested in these issues. Her biography of Josiah Wedgwood wasn't finished when she died of cancer, age 80, leaving the greater part of her substantial inheritance to animal welfare causes, which was a cause very dear to her heart. There were very few obituaries. Henry Hereford, who'd completed that Wedgwood biography, complained about that fact in The Guardian. He protested at the failure to recognise what he described as one of the most gifted English women of her time. 20 years later, E.M. Forster said very much the same thing when her correspondence with Browning was published. Maybe she start to be rediscovered. Well, she is already being rediscovered. Let's hope this goes further, because her range is huge and there's lots still to explore in her work.